Hey there, welcome back. In this video, we will explore how the Celts lived, who they were, who their descendants became, and how they shaped our world in ways that still linger beneath language, landscape, and tradition. Their story is not one of a single empire or a single moment, but of a long presence, scattered, resilient, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature. By watching this video, you'll learn how a loosely connected cultural world spread across much of Europe, adapted to conquest and change, and survived not through monuments of stone, but through memory, belief, and quiet continuity. Imagine the soft crackle of a hearth fire in a wooden hall, smoke rising slowly toward a thatched roof. Outside, the land is damp with early morning mist, the air carrying the scent of wet earth, grass, and distant forests. This is not yet a place called Gaul, Britain, or Ireland. It is simply land, worked, walked, and remembered by people whose names history did not bother to record, but whose lives shaped the foundations of an entire continent. Before we begin, a small note. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history, I upload new videos every day, so consider subscribing and turning on the bell, and tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I love imagining people drifting off to the same story under different skies. Long before the word Celt existed, long before Roman writers tried to categorize the peoples beyond their borders, communities across Central and Western Europe lived in patterns shaped by season, soil, and sky. These people farmed small plots of land, raised cattle and sheep, and moved through landscapes they understood not as property, but as living systems. Rivers were not merely watercourses, they were boundaries, pathways, and sacred presences. Forests were sources of fuel, food, danger, and meaning. Hills and valleys carried stories, even if no one had yet written them down. What we now call the Celts were never a single nation, never united under one ruler, and never bound by one flag or capital. Instead, they were connected by shared languages, artistic styles, religious ideas, and social customs that stretched across vast distances. From the upper Danube to the Atlantic coast, from the Alps to the misty islands of the northwest, similar patterns of life quietly echoed one another. A person traveling these lands might have noticed familiar ways of building, similar tools, recognizable symbols carved into metal or stone, even if local accents and customs varied. Archaeology gives us the first faint outlines of this world. In the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, communities began leaving behind traces that suggest a shared cultural direction. Burial mounds rose above the countryside, marking the resting places of important individuals. Grave goods, weapons, jewelry, finely worked tools were placed with care, suggesting beliefs about status, memory, and perhaps an afterlife that mirrored the living world. These burials were not random. They followed patterns repeated across regions, hinting at a worldview that valued continuity and honor. Life moved slowly, but not simply. The agricultural year dictated labor and rest, planting and harvest, scarcity and abundance. Winters were long and demanded preparation. Summers were busy and unforgiving. Food was preserved, animals were culled carefully, and every resource mattered. In this environment, survival depended not only on strength, but on cooperation. Kinship networks formed the backbone of society, tying families together through marriage, obligation, and shared ancestry. Identity was not abstract. It was felt in daily interactions, reinforced by ritual and repetition. Sound played an important role in this world. The ring of metal against metal, the lowing of cattle, the rhythm of tools striking wood or soil. These were the sounds of ordinary life. Music, likely produced by simple instruments and the human voice, carried stories and memory across generations. Without widespread writing, knowledge lived in people, Elders remembered lineages, agreements, and sacred narratives. Words mattered deeply because once spoken, they lingered in the minds of listeners. The environment shaped belief in subtle ways. Storms were not just weather, they were expressions of unseen forces. Springs that never dried up, groves that felt older than memory, stones placed deliberately in the landscape. These places invited reverence. Over time, a spiritual framework emerged that did not separate the human from the natural. The boundary between people, animals, land, and the divine was thin, almost permeable. To live well meant staying in balance with forces that could not be fully controlled. It is important to understand that when later writers described the Celts, they often did so from the outside, filtering observation through fear, fascination, or political motive. Greek and Roman authors would later portray them as fierce, chaotic, or exotic. Yet beneath those descriptions lay ordinary human lives: parents raising children, farmers worrying about weather, craftsmen perfecting techniques, communities gathering to mark births, deaths, and seasonal turning points. The drama assigned to them by outsiders often obscured the quieter truth of endurance. As centuries passed, technological changes altered daily existence. Iron tools replaced bronze, allowing forests to be cleared more efficiently and fields to be expanded. Weapons became stronger, sharper, more durable. With these changes came shifts in power and status. Those who controlled resources or martial skill gained influence, and social hierarchies grew more defined. Still, authority remained local. Power was personal, negotiated, and dependent on loyalty rather than bureaucracy. Despite this, there was a remarkable consistency across wide regions. Artistic motifs began to appear that favored curves over straight lines, motion over rigidity, spirals, flowing patterns, and abstract animal forms decorated objects meant for both everyday use and ceremonial display. These designs reflected a worldview that emphasized movement, transformation, and continuity rather than fixed permanence. Even in silence, these objects spoke. Over time, the people who lived within this cultural sphere would be recognized and labeled by others. The name Celt itself would be applied unevenly, sometimes broadly, sometimes inaccurately, but long before the label existed, the reality did. A shared way of seeing the world, of organizing life, and of passing meaning from one generation to the next had already taken root. This is where the story truly begins, not with conquest or collapse, but with a living fabric woven quietly across Europe. A world before cities dominated the horizon, before laws were carved into stone tablets, before history demanded written proof. It was a world carried in breath, gesture, and memory, shaped by hands that worked the land and voices that spoke into the dark around the fire. And as the embers glow low and steady, this early Celtic world waits, patient, resilient, and already preparing to change. Part 2. When iron changed the sound of the world. The world you've just stepped into does not stay still for long. It never does. Even in landscapes that seem timeless, change arrives quietly, almost politely, altering daily life before anyone thinks to name what has happened. In the Celtic world, one of the deepest changes comes not with armies or borders, but with a new sound, the dull, ringing strike of iron being worked into shape. Iron does not announce itself the way bronze once did, as a rare and carefully traded material. It is heavier, darker, more demanding. It resists the hand before yielding, and when it does, it leaves behind tools and weapons that feel different in the palm, stronger, more permanent. Across Central Europe, sometime in the early first millennium before the Common Era, iron begins to replace bronze in everyday use, and with it, the rhythm of life subtly shifts. Fields can now be cleared more efficiently. Forest edges retreat as iron axes bite deeper into wood. plows cut more reliably into stubborn soil, opening new land for cultivation. Farming communities expand their reach, not dramatically, but steadily, season by season. With more dependable tools comes a slightly greater sense of control over the environment, though never complete mastery. Weather still dictates success or failure, and hunger remains a familiar presence, but the balance tilts just a little. This period, often associated with what archaeologists call the Hallstatt culture, leaves behind traces that feel heavier than those of earlier times. Burial sites become more elaborate. Some graves are marked by large mounds rising gently from the landscape, visible reminders of status and memory. Inside them, iron swords, spears, and richly decorated objects rest beside the dead. These are not casual inclusions. They suggest a society increasingly aware of rank, lineage, and reputation, qualities that could endure beyond a single lifetime. The soundscape of daily life changes as well. Blacksmiths become central figures in their communities. The forge, with its heat, sparks, and smoke, feels almost sacred. Ironworking requires skill, patience, and knowledge that cannot be easily guessed or copied. The smith understands fire in an intimate way, coaxing metal into useful forms through repeated heating and hammering. In many Celtic societies, this knowledge grants a quiet prestige, bordering on reverence. To shape iron is to negotiate with forces that feel elemental. As iron weapons spread, conflict takes on a different texture. Warfare does not suddenly become constant, but it becomes more decisive. Raids, territorial disputes, and demonstrations of strength grow sharper in their consequences. A well-made iron blade lasts longer and strikes harder. Shields, armor, and fortifications adapt in response. Yet even here, violence remains bounded by social rules. Combat is tied to honor, reputation, and the defense of community rather than conquest for its own sake. At the same time, long-distance connections strengthen. Iron ore does not exist everywhere in equal quality, and neither do the skills to work it well. Trade routes expand, linking inland communities with coastal regions and mountain passes. Salt, essential for preserving food, travels alongside metal. Amber from the Baltic appears far from its source, warm and luminous against darker materials. Wine, imported from Mediterranean cultures, begins to circulate among elites, its taste carrying hints of distant worlds. These exchanges do more than move goods, they move ideas. Decorative styles begin to converge across regions. Certain shapes, patterns, and preferences repeat themselves, suggesting shared tastes and values. Objects meant for display, brooches, weapon fittings, ceremonial vessels, become canvases for artistic expression. Curves begin to dominate over straight lines. Forms feel alive, flowing, as if refusing to settle into rigid geometry. Even in metal, motion is implied. Daily life, however, remains grounded. Most people spend their days tending animals, repairing tools, preparing food, and navigating the small negotiations of communal living. Houses are simple, built from wood, clay, and thatch, designed to keep out rain and cold rather than impress. Smoke hangs low inside during winter months, clinging to hair and clothing. The scent of hearth fires becomes a constant companion, mixing with earth and animal musk. Social bonds tighten in response to change. Kinship grows more formally defined, as inheritance and status become increasingly important. Who you are related to matters. Who remembers your ancestors matters. Oral tradition adapts, absorbing new stories of heroes, conflicts, and migrations. The spoken word stretches to hold a growing past, and those skilled in memory, poets, storytellers, ritual specialists, gain influence. They are not merely entertainers, they are custodians of continuity. Despite these developments, there is still no single Celtic authority, no capital city, no centralized law. Power remains distributed, negotiated through alliances and personal loyalty. Communities recognize one another through shared customs rather than imposed rule. Identity is flexible, layered, and local, even as it participates in a wider cultural sphere. At night, when the forge cools and the fields fall silent, the world feels heavier than before, but also more defined. Iron tools rest near doorways. Weapons hang within reach. The future feels both promising and uncertain, shaped by materials newly mastered but not fully understood. Change has arrived, not as a disruption, but as a deepening, adding weight, sound, and consequence to lives already rich with meaning. And as the sparks fade into darkness, the Celtic world steps fully into the Iron Age, carrying with it the quiet knowledge that strength, once discovered, can never be forgotten. Part 3. The curved language of Latin. Change does not always arrive as something entirely new. Sometimes it refines what already exists, giving it shape, rhythm, and a kind of visual voice. In the Celtic world of the Iron Age, this refinement appears most clearly in what archaeologists later call the Latin culture. Not a sudden break from the past, but a flowering, a moment when ideas about beauty, belief, and identity begin to speak more clearly through objects left behind. The landscapes remain familiar. Rivers still wind through valleys, forests still press close to settlements, and hills continue to serve as landmarks both practical and symbolic. Yet, within this continuity, something subtle shifts. The objects people carry, wear, and bury with their dead begin to look different. Metalwork grows more confident, more expressive. Iron is no longer only functional, it becomes a surface for meaning. Latin favors curves over angles, movement over stillness. Spirals unfurl across sword scabbards, shields, and brooches, never quite closing in on themselves. Lines flow, split, and rejoin, suggesting transformation rather than completion. Animals appear not as realistic portraits, but as suggestions. A bird, S-head emerging from a swirl, a beast's body dissolving into pattern. These designs do not demand to be read like text. They ask to be felt. This aesthetic is not random decoration. It reflects a way of seeing the world. In Celtic thought, as far as we can reconstruct it, reality is not fixed. Life moves in cycles, day and night, summer and winter, birth and death. The boundaries between states, living and dead, human and divine, natural and supernatural, are thin and permeable. The art mirrors this understanding. Nothing is entirely separate. Everything flows into something else. Objects bearing Latin designs often serve important social roles. Weapons carried into battle are adorned not simply to impress, but to embody protection, identity, and perhaps favor from unseen forces. Jewelry marks status, age, and belonging, catching light during movement and ritual. Even everyday items may carry subtle decoration, a reminder that usefulness and meaning are not opposed. The act of making these objects requires patience and skill. Craftsmen heat metal repeatedly, hammering and bending it into complex shapes. Inlay techniques introduce contrasting materials, creating visual tension and depth. Color appears through enamel and polished surfaces, glowing briefly in firelight or sunlight. The process itself feels ritualized, as if the transformation of raw material into finished form echoes broader acts of creation. Socially, this period sees the continued importance of local elites, but power remains personal rather than institutional. Leadership is demonstrated through generosity, protection, and the ability to maintain alliances. Feasting plays a key role. Large gatherings reinforce bonds, settle disputes, and display wealth. Imported goods, Mediterranean wine vessels, exotic ornaments appear at these events, their foreign origins adding to their prestige. Trade routes pulse quietly across the continent. Rivers serve as arteries, carrying goods and stories. Salt, essential for survival, moves alongside iron and decorative items. Amber glows softly in northern regions before traveling south. Each exchange strengthens a sense of connection without erasing local identity. People remain rooted in their land even as they participate in wider networks. Sound and movement animate these gatherings. Music, likely produced by horns, simple stringed instruments, and voice, fills open spaces. Dancers move in circles or lines, feet pressing into earth already marked by generations. Firelight flickers across curved metal surfaces, bringing patterns to life. In these moments, art is not static. It breathes. Yet this flowering of expression does not mean peace or unity. Competition remains part of life. Raids, rivalries, and displays of strength continue, shaped by honor and reputation. Hilltop fortifications grow more complex in some regions, offering refuge during times of threat. These are not cities in the later sense, but communal strongholds, places of gathering, storage, and defense. Despite these tensions, there is no sense of a single Celtic destiny. The Latin world is shared, but it is not centralized. Communities adapt styles to their own needs, blending influences with local tradition. What unites them is not obedience to authority, but participation in a cultural conversation carried through objects, stories, and ritual. As time passes, these curved forms spread widely, from the heart of Europe toward its edges. They appear in places that will later be named Gaul, Britain, and beyond. The designs travel more easily than people, carried by trade, imitation, and shared taste. They become a visual shorthand for belonging, a quiet declaration of connection in a vast and varied landscape. In the glow of evening fires, as tools are set aside and metal cools, these patterns remain. They do not tell a single story, but many at once. They speak of movement, balance, and endurance. They remind those who live among them that the world is not made of straight lines, but of curves, bending, returning, and always in motion. And as this language of form settles into daily life, it prepares the Celtic world for what comes next: wider contact, greater pressure, and encounters that will test whether such fluid identity can survive the hard edges of empire. Part 4. A civilization without cities. The Celtic world that takes shape through art and shared custom remains, at its core, a landscape without cities, in the way later ages will understand them. There are no vast stone capitals rising above surrounding land, no fixed centers from which laws radiate outward in neat lines. Instead, life unfolds across a mosaic of territories, each shaped by geography, kinship, and memory. Power does not sit behind walls permanently. It moves with people, gatherings, and seasons. Settlements are modest and adaptable. Most communities live in small clusters of round houses, built from timber, clay, and thatch, positioned to take advantage of water sources, fertile soil, and natural shelter. Smoke escapes slowly through roofs, leaving interiors dim but warm. Floors are packed earth, worn smooth by years of footsteps. These are homes designed for continuity rather than permanence, easily repaired, altered, or abandoned if circumstances demand it. Above these everyday spaces rise hill forts, scattered across ridges and elevated ground. They are among the most striking features of the Celtic landscape, yet they are often misunderstood. Hill forts are not cities in constant use, nor are they purely military structures. They serve multiple roles at once: seasonal gathering places, symbols of communal identity, refuges in times of danger, and centers of trade and ritual. Their ramparts curve with the land, following contours rather than imposing straight lines, as if acknowledging the terrain rather than conquering it. Within these fortified spaces, people gather periodically. Livestock is brought inside, goods are exchanged, disputes are settled, and alliances reaffirmed. The soundscape changes during these moments. Voices overlap, animals stir, metal rings against metal, and fires burn in greater numbers. When the gathering ends, the hill fort quiets again, waiting patiently for the next occasion. It is not abandoned, it is resting. This pattern reflects a broader Celtic approach to organization, Society is structured around tribes and subgroups bound by kinship, oath, and shared obligation. Authority flows through personal relationships rather than formal offices. Leaders are recognized through reputation, their ability to protect, provide, and maintain balance within the group. A chieftain who fails to meet expectations can lose influence just as quickly as they gained it. Power here is conditional and constantly negotiated. Without cities, movement becomes essential. People travel frequently between settlements, pastures, forests, and ritual sites. Paths form through repeated use rather than planned construction, winding along ridgelines, riverbanks, and clearings. These routes carry more than people. They carry news, gossip, and memory. A story heard in one valley may change slightly by the time it reaches the next, adapting to local concerns while retaining its core. Economically, this world is flexible and resilient. Agriculture remains central, but it is supplemented by herding, hunting, fishing, and gathering. Cattle, in particular, hold deep significance as sources of food, labor, and wealth. Ownership of livestock often matters more than possession of land, reinforcing a system where value can move rather than remain fixed. Wealth is visible in animals, ornaments, and the ability to host feasts, not in stone buildings or coinage alone. Feasting acts as a social glue. Large meals bring communities together, redistributing resources and reinforcing hierarchies. Food is prepared communally, consumed publicly, and remembered afterward through story. Generosity enhances status, stinginess erodes it. These gatherings are moments where the social fabric is repaired and strengthened, thread by thread. The absence of cities also shapes how belief is practiced. Sacred spaces are rarely monumental. Instead, they are woven into the natural world. A grove of trees, a spring that never runs dry, a clearing where the land feels older and quieter. These places are approached with respect rather than domination. Offerings are left, not displayed. Rituals are performed, then allowed to fade back into silence. The sacred is encountered, not enclosed. This decentralization gives the Celtic world a certain adaptability. Without rigid institutions, communities can respond to change quickly. Alliances shift, groups migrate or fragment. New influences are absorbed gradually rather than imposed suddenly. Yet this same flexibility carries risk. Without centralized authority, large-scale coordination is difficult. When faced with highly organized external powers, this strength can become a vulnerability. Still, for centuries, this system works. It produces art, sustains populations, and maintains a shared cultural identity across wide distances. It allows difference without fragmentation, connection without uniformity. People know who they are not because a state tells them, but because their relationships, rituals, and stories remind them daily. At dusk, as light softens across fields and hills, smoke rises from scattered homes rather than a single skyline. The land does not belong to a city. The city, such as it is, belongs to the land. In this quiet arrangement, the Celtic world continues, not dense, not centralized, but deeply rooted. And as paths stretch outward and contacts multiply, this civilization without cities edges closer to encounters that will challenge whether such a way of life can endure. Part 5, Roads of Amber and Salt. The Celtic world, spread wide and without a single center, is never isolated. Even without cities or paved roads, it is threaded together by movement, slow, steady, and persistent. Paths form where feet, hooves, and carts pass again and again, pressing memory into soil. These routes are not drawn on maps, yet they connect distant regions through exchange, obligation, and curiosity. Long before empires impose order, trade quietly does its work. One of the most important substances moving through this world is salt. It preserves meat through long winters, sustains herds, and makes settled life possible. Where salt can be harvested, from springs, mines, or coastal flats, communities gain influence. Control of salt does not look like rule, it looks like access. It shapes alliances, encourages seasonal travel, and gives certain regions quiet importance within the wider Celtic sphere. Amber follows similar paths. Warm to the touch and glowing softly in firelight, it travels from the Baltic coast far into Central and Southern Europe. To those who carry it, amber is more than ornament. It feels alive, charged with something unseen. Worn against skin or placed in graves, it becomes a marker of connection to distant shores, proof that the world extends far beyond the horizon of one's daily life. Alongside these materials move iron tools, crafted ornaments, hides, wool, and livestock. Cattle are driven along familiar routes, their bells marking progress through valleys and over passes. People walk with them, traders, messengers, relatives, traveling between kin groups. News travels slowly but reliably this way, changing tone and detail with each retelling. A conflict in one region becomes a cautionary tale in another. A successful harvest becomes a story of fortune and favor. Rivers play a central role in this network. Flowing quietly across landscapes, they serve as natural highways. Boats carry goods downstream. Paths follow banks where walking is easier and landmarks familiar. Rivers also divide territories, acting as boundaries that are respected even when they are not formally marked. Crossing them often carries ritual significance, a moment of transition from one social space to another. Through these exchanges, the Celtic world comes into increasing contact with the Mediterranean. Greek and Etruscan traders appear at its edges, bringing wine, ceramics, and new forms of metalwork. These items are not absorbed wholesale, they are adapted. Wine, consumed in communal feasts, becomes a symbol of status and connection to distant cultures. Imported vessels are reused, repaired, and sometimes buried, gaining meanings their makers never intended. These encounters do not erase local identity. Instead, they layer it. Celtic artisans imitate foreign forms, but reshape them through familiar aesthetics, adding curves, symbols, and patterns that root the object in local tradition. The result is a dialogue rather than a replacement, a conversation carried out in metal, clay, and gesture. Travel itself shapes the people who undertake it. Moving across long distances exposes individuals to different dialects, customs, and landscapes. Over time, this familiarity reduces fear of the unfamiliar. Difference becomes expected rather than threatening. This openness allows the Celtic world to remain diverse without fragmenting entirely, united by practice rather than authority. Yet trade also brings awareness of imbalance. Some regions grow wealthier than others. Certain leaders gain prestige by controlling key routes or hosting gatherings that attract traders. With wealth comes competition, and with competition, tension. Disputes arise over access, tolls, and obligations. Still, these conflicts remain largely local, managed through negotiation, marriage alliances, and, when necessary, displays of force. At a sensory level, trade introduces new experiences, the taste of wine, sharp and unfamiliar, the smooth coolness of polished ceramics, the scent of resins and oils carried from warmer climates. These sensations expand the perceived world, making it richer and more complex. Even those who never travel feel these changes through objects that arrive quietly in their communities. As night falls along these routes, travelers gather near fires, sharing food and stories. The crackle of flames mixes with foreign words and familiar laughter. Goods are secured, animals settled, and plans made for the next stretch of the journey. In these moments, the Celtic world feels vast, yet intimate, connected not by roads of stone, but by trust, repetition, and memory. These roads of amber and salt do not lead toward empire, at least not yet. They lead toward understanding, of distance, difference, and possibility. And as contacts multiply, they prepare the Celtic world for encounters that will soon carry greater weight, bringing not just goods and stories, but expectations, judgments, and eventually the attention of powers that move very differently through the world. Part 6. The spoken world of Druids. As the Celtic world grows more interconnected through trade, movement, and shared custom, one feature becomes increasingly clear. Knowledge here does not live in books. It lives in people, in memory, in voice, in carefully preserved patterns of speech and ritual. At the center of this spoken world stand figures who are difficult to define with precision, yet impossible to ignore. Those later writers will call Druids. To imagine the Druidic world, it helps to set aside modern expectations of priests, scholars, or officials. Druids are not confined to temples, nor are they separated cleanly from everyday life. They move among communities, recognized not by uniform clothing or architecture, but by their role as keepers of memory, interpreters of law, and mediators between human and unseen forces. Their authority does not come from force, it comes from trust, built slowly over years of learning and observation. Education in this world is deliberate and demanding. Knowledge is passed orally, often through long periods of apprenticeship. Young learners listen, repeat, and memorize vast bodies of material, genealogies, legal principles, ritual formulas, stories of origins and migrations. The process takes years, sometimes decades. Writing is known in the broader Celtic world, especially through contact with Mediterranean cultures, but Druids intentionally limit its use for sacred or formal knowledge. Memory, not text, is considered the proper vessel for wisdom. This choice shapes the entire culture. When knowledge must be remembered, it becomes rhythmic. Language develops patterns that aid recall. Repetition, alliteration, carefully balanced phrases. Stories are not told once. They are told many times, each retelling reinforcing communal identity. Forgetting is dangerous, not merely inconvenient. To forget is to lose connection with ancestors, agreements, and obligations that hold society together. The spoken word carries legal weight. Disputes over land, cattle, or honor are often settled through recitation of precedent rather than written contracts. Druids and other learned figures recall earlier judgments, tracing lines of responsibility and compensation. Justice is not abstract. It is personal, contextual, and embedded in social relationships. Punishment aims to restore balance rather than impose uniform penalty. Ritual, too, relies on voice and presence. Ceremonies marking seasonal transitions, births, deaths, and alliances are guided by spoken formulas, gestures, and offerings. These acts are performed in places that feel charged: groves of trees, riverbanks, clearings where sound carries differently. The natural environment participates in the ritual: wind through leaves, water moving over stone, fire crackling softly. These sounds become part of the ceremony, blurring the line between human action and natural process. Because knowledge is embodied, Druids are also observers. They watch the sky, noting the movement of stars and the rhythm of seasons. They study animal behavior, plant cycles, and weather patterns. This observation is not detached or experimental in the modern sense. It is relational. The world is read as a network of signs, each connected to others. Understanding comes from attentiveness rather than control. Socially, Druids occupy a position that crosses tribal boundaries. While loyalty to one's kin group remains strong, Druids often serve multiple communities, traveling between them. This mobility gives them a broader perspective and allows them to act as intermediaries. In times of conflict, their presence can slow escalation. Agreements sworn in their hearing carry greater weight, as breaking such oaths risks not only social consequences but spiritual imbalance. Yet their influence should not be exaggerated into centralized authority. Druids do not rule. They advise, interpret, and remember. Their power depends on continued respect. A Druid who fails to act with wisdom can lose standing, just as any leader can. Authority remains distributed, anchored in relationships rather than institutions. From the outside, this system can appear opaque. Later Roman writers, accustomed to written law and formal hierarchy, struggle to categorize what they observe. They describe druids as philosophers, judges, magicians, or priests, often blending fear with fascination. These accounts are colored by misunderstanding and political motive, yet they hint at something real, a class of people whose influence rests on knowledge that cannot be seized or easily destroyed. Daily life continues around this learned world. Farmers tend fields, herders move animals, craftsmen work iron and wood. Most people will never become druids, but they live within a framework shaped by druidic knowledge. Ritual calendars influence agricultural timing. Legal customs guide inheritance and marriage. Stories explain why certain places are respected or avoided. Even those who do not fully understand the reasoning accept the structure it provides. At night, when fires burn low and conversation softens, stories surface. Tales of ancestors, heroes, and encounters with otherworldly forces circulate quietly. These stories are not escapism, they are instruction. They encode values, warn against excess, and remind listeners of their place within a long continuum. The past is not distant here. It speaks directly, through voices that remember. This spoken world creates remarkable resilience. Without reliance on documents or monuments, Celtic societies carry their identity internally. Knowledge cannot be burned or dismantled easily. It moves with people, adapting as circumstances change. This flexibility will soon be tested as external powers accustomed to written control and centralized command begin to press closer. For now, though, the druidic tradition holds. Words are spoken carefully, memory is honored, the world is listened to as much as it is acted upon. And in this quiet discipline of attention, the Celtic world prepares, unknowingly, for encounters that will challenge whether voice alone can withstand the weight of empire. Part 7. Gods of Grove and River. The Celtic world, shaped by memory and voice, is also shaped by a sense that the land itself is alive with presence. Belief does not gather behind walls or rise in carefully planned architecture. It settles instead into places, into the curve of a river, the shade of a grove, the stillness of a spring where water rises silently from stone. Here, divinity is not distant. It is encountered, quietly and often unexpectedly, in the spaces where daily life brushes against something older and less easily named. There is no single Celtic pantheon arranged neatly in hierarchy. Deities vary by region, by tribe, by landscape. Some are known widely under different names. Others are deeply local, remembered only where a particular hill casts its shadow or a particular river bends. What unites them is not uniform identity, but function and feeling. These gods are tied to fertility, healing, war, craft, travel, and protection, forces that shape survival in a world still governed by uncertainty. Sacred places emerge organically. A stand of ancient trees becomes a grove because it feels set apart, its air cooler, its silence deeper. A river crossing gains meaning because people have paused there for generations, offering thanks before and after passage. Springs are especially potent. Water that rises from unseen depths carries an aura of connection between worlds. Offerings left nearby, metal objects, coins, weapons, ornaments, speak not of waste, but of exchange. Something is given so that balance may be maintained. Ritual in this world is intimate rather than grand. It often involves small groups rather than crowds, gestures rather than spectacle. A libation poured quietly, a vow spoken aloud, an object placed carefully where it will not be retrieved. These acts are less about display than about alignment, ensuring that human action remains in harmony with forces beyond control. The gods are not omnipotent overseers, They are participants in a shared environment. Animals occupy a special place in this belief system. Certain creatures, boars, horses, birds, appear repeatedly in art and story, not merely as symbols, but as intermediaries. They move between spaces humans cannot easily access: forest depths, open skies, liminal boundaries. Their behavior is watched closely. An unexpected appearance can be read as a sign, a message that invites interpretation rather than certainty. Time itself carries sacred weight. The year is divided not only by agricultural necessity, but by ritual thresholds. Seasonal festivals mark moments when boundaries thin between light and dark, growth and decay, life and death. These occasions are communal, blending celebration with caution. Fires are lit, extinguished, and relit. Old agreements are renewed, new ones cautiously formed. The future feels briefly open, malleable. Death is not treated as an ending so much as a transition. Burial practices vary, but they consistently suggest continuity. Grave goods accompany the dead not as luxury, but as necessity. Weapons, tools, ornaments, and food imply movement rather than rest. The afterlife is not fully described, but it is assumed. The dead remain present, watching, influencing, remembered through names and stories spoken aloud. This religious landscape resists centralization. There are no universal doctrines, no fixed scriptures. Belief is lived rather than declared. It adapts naturally to local conditions, absorbing new influences while maintaining core sensibilities. When communities encounter foreign gods through trade or migration, these deities are often interpreted through familiar frameworks rather than rejected outright. A Roman god may be associated with a local spring. A foreign symbol may find a place beside older ones. Because belief is embedded in place, it is also vulnerable. Sacred groves can be cut down. Springs can be claimed or redirected. Ritual sites can be ignored or repurposed. Yet this vulnerability is offset by dispersion. There is no single center to destroy, no temple whose fall ends a tradition. Sacredness lives wherever attention and memory are maintained. As night settles over the landscape, fires flicker near water and wood. Voices lower. Offerings are made without ceremony, their meaning understood by those present. The gods are not summoned loudly. They are acknowledged. In this quiet relationship, the Celtic world finds stability, not in control, but in respect. Soon, however, a culture with very different assumptions about gods, power, and place will turn its gaze northward. Where the Celtic world sees presence, others will see territory. Where belief is fluid, others will seek structure. And in that coming encounter, groves and rivers will become more than sacred spaces. They will become silent witnesses to change. Part 8. When Rome looked north. For centuries, the Celtic world has existed largely on its own terms, adaptive, decentralized, woven together by memory, ritual, and exchange rather than command. But history has a way of narrowing distances. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, another kind of world begins to press closer, one that understands land, power, and time very differently. From the south, across mountains and rivers, Rome starts to look north. At first, this attention is distant and abstract. Roman merchants encounter Celtic traders along frontier zones, exchanging wine, ceramics, and coin for raw materials and labor. Roman soldiers hear stories, exaggerated, fearful, dismissive, of tall warriors, strange customs, and lands that feel untamed. These early impressions are fragmented, filtered through rumor rather than experience. The Celtic world exists in Roman imagination as a place of excess and unpredictability, impressive but inferior, worthy of fascination, yet destined, so it is assumed, to be ordered. Rome's worldview is shaped by cities, roads, and written law. Power radiates outward from defined centers, enforced by bureaucracy and disciplined force. Identity is recorded, categorized, and fixed. In contrast, the Celtic world resists easy mapping. Its boundaries shift with alliances and seasons. Authority rests in reputation rather than office. To Roman observers, this fluidity reads as weakness, a lack waiting to be filled. As Roman expansion accelerates, curiosity gives way to calculation. The lands to the north are rich in resources, fertile soil, forests, metals, manpower. They also sit uncomfortably close to Roman frontiers. What is not controlled is perceived as a threat. Rome does not tolerate ambiguity for long. Where it cannot negotiate lasting dominance, it prepares to impose it. The first serious contacts are not immediately violent. Roman generals and envoys attempt diplomacy, forming alliances with certain Celtic groups against others. Gifts are exchanged, hostages are taken, not as punishment, but as insurance. Some Celtic leaders see opportunity in this relationship, hoping to strengthen their own position by aligning with a powerful outsider. Others sense danger, but lack a unified means of resistance. Without a centralized authority, responses differ from region to region. The Roman military presence introduces new sensations into the Celtic landscape. The sound of marching feet moving in unison, the sight of straight roads cutting through terrain without regard for natural curves. Fortified camps appear almost overnight, geometric and disciplined, imposing order on land that has long followed organic lines. To those who encounter them, these camps feel unnatural, rigid, unsettling. Culturally, misunderstandings deepen. Roman writers describe Celtic religion with suspicion, focusing on practices they find disturbing or incomprehensible. Druidic rituals, especially those involving sacrifice, are framed as evidence of barbarism rather than contextual belief. These portrayals serve a purpose, they justify intervention. To civilize, Rome must first define what it considers uncivilized. Yet even as Rome looks north with intent, the Celtic world does not collapse inward. Life continues, fields are planted, rituals are observed, trade flows along familiar routes. Many communities remain unaware of how dramatically their future is being recalibrated by forces beyond their horizon. For them, Rome is still distant, a name carried by travelers, not a reality shaping daily decisions. Those who do encounter Roman power more directly experience a mix of awe and unease. Roman goods are impressive, durable, standardized, efficient. Coins circulate, bearing faces of distant rulers whose authority feels abstract and impersonal. Roman law introduces new concepts of ownership and obligation that conflict with existing customs. Where Celtic justice emphasizes restoration and balance, Roman law emphasizes order and precedent. The emotional contrast is stark. The Celtic world values adaptability, story, and relationship. Rome values predictability, documentation, and control. Where one listens, the other records. Where one negotiates identity through memory, the other defines it through inscription. These differences are not merely administrative. They reach into how people understand themselves and their place in time. As Roman attention intensifies, so does pressure along the frontier. Military campaigns test Celtic defenses, probing for weakness. Some hill forts are abandoned rather than defended, their value symbolic rather than strategic against organized legions. Others become points of resistance, rallying local groups temporarily before being bypassed or overwhelmed. Resistance is brave, but fragmented. Still, it would be wrong to imagine the Celtic world as passive. Leaders debate, alliances shift, strategies emerge. Some communities retreat deeper into less accessible terrain. Others engage diplomatically, seeking coexistence. The response is as varied as the world itself, reflecting the absence of a single path forward. At night, as Roman camps glow steadily in the distance, their fires arranged with unsettling precision, Celtic fires burn as they always have, scattered, personal, tied to households rather than command. The contrast is visible even in darkness. Two ways of organizing life now face one another across rivers and fields, neither fully understanding the other, both convinced, in different ways, of their own necessity. Rome has not yet conquered the Celtic world, but it has noticed it, and in history, to be noticed by Rome is rarely a neutral event. The gaze itself carries weight, reshaping possibilities before the first decisive blow is struck. Part 9. Caesar and the Breaking of Gaul. When Rome finally moves from watching to acting, it does so with a confidence shaped by centuries of conquest. The encounter between Rome and the Celtic world reaches its most decisive early moment in Gaul, a vast region of forests, rivers, and tribal territories that roughly corresponds to much of modern France and its surroundings. Here, the Celtic way of life meets an opponent unlike any it has faced before, disciplined, relentless, and determined to turn complexity into order. For the Celtic communities of Gaul, the world has always been plural. Tribes compete, ally, feud, and reconcile. Power shifts with circumstance. No single leader speaks for all, and no shared strategy binds everyone together. This fluidity has long been a strength, allowing adaptation and survival across generations. But against Rome, it becomes a liability. Julius Caesar enters this landscape not merely as a general, but as a narrator. His campaigns are recorded in his own words, carefully shaped for political consumption back in Rome. Through his accounts, Gaul becomes a stage on which Roman virtue, discipline, and destiny are performed. The Celts appear as brave but disorganized, fierce but lacking cohesion. This portrayal is not accidental. It transforms conquest into necessity, resistance into justification. The Roman legions move with unsettling efficiency. Roads are built as they advance, straight and purposeful, slicing through terrain that once dictated movement. Fortified camps rise quickly, their layout identical regardless of location. This repetition sends a clear message. Rome brings its world with it, imposing familiarity on foreign land. For Celtic communities accustomed to organic growth and negotiated space, this uniformity feels alien and oppressive. Resistance emerges unevenly. Some tribes attempt to negotiate, offering loyalty in exchange for autonomy. Others fight fiercely, defending hill forts and familiar ground. Battles are brutal, but often brief. Roman tactics favor endurance and coordination over individual valor. Celtic warriors fight with courage and local knowledge, but without unified command. Their efforts fracture under sustained pressure. The figure of Vercingetorix briefly alters this pattern. A leader capable of imagining unity among divided tribes, he rallies Gaul around a shared goal, resistance through coordination. His strategy is not merely military, but psychological. He understands that Rome relies on supply lines and order. By scorched earth tactics, burning settlements, denying resources, he attempts to turn Rome's strengths into weaknesses. For a moment, it almost works. Roman forces are strained. Campaigns stall. The Celtic world glimpses what unity might achieve, but the effort comes at immense cost. Communities are asked to sacrifice their homes, their harvests, their immediate survival for a collective future that remains uncertain. Not all comply. Fractures reappear. Loyalty wavers. The decisive confrontation at Alesia becomes emblematic of the larger conflict. Surrounded by Roman fortifications built not outward, but inward and outward simultaneously, Vercingetorix's forces are trapped. The engineering itself feels symbolic. Rome enclosing the Celtic world, cutting off movement, forcing decision. Starvation sets in. Hope thins. Eventually, surrender follows. The fall of Alesia does not simply end a campaign, it marks a rupture. Gaul is broken not only militarily, but structurally. Roman administration moves in behind the legions. Tribal territories are reorganized. Taxes are imposed. Census replaces oral memory. Law is written, posted, enforced impersonally. The land is measured, divided, and recorded. For ordinary people, the change is gradual but profound. Life continues, fields are worked, families formed, rituals observed, yet everything now exists under an external framework. Decisions once settled through negotiation and precedent are now subject to Roman authority. Disputes are judged by officials unfamiliar with local custom. Identity becomes something assigned rather than remembered. Religiously, pressure builds. Druidic practices, especially those associated with public authority or sacrifice, are discouraged or suppressed. Sacred groves are cut or neglected. Ritual spaces lose protection. Some beliefs adapt quietly, slipping into private practice or blending with Roman forms. Others fade as their social foundation erodes. Emotionally, this period is marked by disorientation. The world still looks familiar, but it feels altered. Roads are straighter, towns grow denser, coins circulate widely, replacing gift exchange and obligation with abstraction. Time itself feels different, structured by Roman calendars and administrative cycles rather than seasonal intuition alone. Yet even in defeat, the Celtic world does not vanish. It withdraws, reshapes itself, and persists in subtler forms. Language survives in homes and villages. Customs endure where Roman oversight is light. Art adapts, incorporating Roman motifs while retaining curved sensibilities beneath surface conformity. Caesar's victory secures his legacy, but it also ensures that the Celtic world will be remembered largely through Roman eyes. This imbalance shapes centuries of understanding. What is written survives. What is spoken must find quieter paths forward. As Roman banners rise over Gaul, the fires in Celtic hearths continue to burn, smaller perhaps, more cautious, but not extinguished. The breaking of Gaul is not the end of the Celtic story. It is a transformation, painful, uneven, and incomplete, setting the stage for a long negotiation between memory and power that will unfold far beyond the battlefield. Part 10. Life beneath Roman stone. After conquest comes something quieter, heavier, and in many ways more enduring than war. The clash of weapons fades, banners are folded away, and Roman power settles into the landscape not as an invading force, but as a system. For the Celtic world of Gaul and neighboring regions, this phase is not marked by a single dramatic moment, but by accumulation, stone laid upon stone, rule layered over custom, habit reshaped by repetition. Roman roads are among the first lasting changes. They cut through forests, marshes, and hills with deliberate straightness, indifferent to older paths that once followed contours and memory. These roads are not only military tools, they are statements. They announce permanence, predictability, and reach. Along them move officials, merchants, soldiers, and messengers, binding the conquered land into a wider imperial network. Distance shrinks. Authority travels faster than rumor ever could. Towns grow where forts once stood. Some Celtic settlements expand into Roman-style urban centers, complete with forums, baths, temples, and administrative buildings. Stone replaces wood, rectangles replace circles, roof tiles replace thatch. These changes bring practical benefits, improved sanitation, new crafts, greater trade, but they also reframe daily life. People begin to live closer together under rules enforced by strangers whose loyalty lies not with kin, but with empire. Roman law introduces a new logic of order. Property is defined precisely. Land is surveyed, measured, and recorded. Taxes are assessed and collected regularly, not negotiated episodically. Disputes are resolved through written codes applied uniformly, rather than through oral precedent adjusted to circumstance. For some, this brings a sense of stability. For others, it feels constraining, alien, and impersonal. Language shifts slowly. Latin becomes the language of administration, commerce, and opportunity. Those who learn it gain access to positions of influence, military advancement, and legal protection. Celtic languages retreat into private spaces, homes, villages, rituals spoken softly. Bilingualism becomes common but uneven. A child may speak one language in the marketplace and another at the hearth, learning early that identity can be situational. Religion adapts rather than collapses outright. Roman gods arrive, but they do not simply replace local deities. Instead, they merge. A Celtic god associated with a spring may be identified with a Roman healing deity. A local war god may be linked to Mars. Temples are built near older sacred sites, stone structures rising where groves once stood. Offerings continue, though their form changes. What was once whispered becomes inscribed. Druidic authority, however, declines sharply. Rome views any independent source of law or loyalty with suspicion. Druids, as custodians of memory and moral authority, represent a rival structure. Their public role diminishes. Some adapt, becoming local ritual specialists or teachers. Others withdraw. Much of what they once preserved openly now survives only indirectly, embedded in story and custom. Economically, integration brings both opportunity and inequality. Trade flourishes along Roman routes. Artisans produce goods for wider markets. Coinage becomes common, transforming how value is understood and exchanged. Yet wealth concentrates unevenly. Those aligned with Roman administration prosper. Rural communities, farther from roads and towns, see fewer benefits and greater burdens. The countryside remains more conservative. Here, Roman influence is filtered and softened. Fields are worked as they always have been. Seasonal rhythms persist. Old festivals continue under new names or alongside new observances. The land resists total transformation. It absorbs change selectively, maintaining continuity where possible. Emotionally, this period is complex. There is no single Celtic response to Roman rule. Some embrace it, finding security and advancement within the imperial system. Others resent it quietly, maintaining distance and skepticism. Many simply adapt pragmatically, doing what is necessary to survive while holding on to what feels essential. Generations pass under Roman stone. Children grow up knowing no other system. For them, Rome is not an intruder. It is the background of life. Yet traces of older worlds remain, faint but persistent. A curved design on a household object, a story told differently than the official version, a ritual performed at dawn before anyone else is awake. Time itself feels layered. The present is Roman, structured and recorded. The past is Celtic, remembered and felt rather than written. The future is uncertain, imagined through both lenses. This coexistence creates a quiet tension, not explosive, but constant, between what is imposed and what is inherited. As Roman authority deepens, it also begins to stretch thin. Managing vast territories requires resources and attention. Frontiers demand defense. Internal politics distract. The empire feels solid, but its solidity depends on continued effort. Beneath the stone, beneath the roads and laws, older rhythms persist, waiting. Life beneath Roman stone is not simply life after defeat. It is life in negotiation, between memory and adaptation, between survival and surrender. The Celtic world does not disappear here. It becomes quieter, more cautious, and more inward, preserving itself not in monuments, but in habits and hearts. And as the empire reaches its height, its shadow grows long. Beyond its edges, and even within them, places remain where Rome's grip is lighter, where older ways breathe more freely. It is toward these spaces that the Celtic story will next drift, carried not by conquest, but by distance and endurance. Part 11, Islands Beyond the Empire. There are places where empire slows, not because it chooses to, but because the land itself resists easy possession. Beyond the firm reach of Roman stone and law lie the islands and margins of the Northwest, regions where roads grow fewer, administration thinner, and older rhythms continue to breathe more freely. Here, The Celtic world does not retreat so much as it endures, altered but not absorbed, carrying forward patterns of life that elsewhere have been pressed into quieter corners. Britain presents Rome with both opportunity and frustration. The southern lowlands, accessible and agriculturally rich, fold more readily into imperial systems. Towns rise, villas spread across worked fields, and Roman customs take hold among elites. But as one moves north and west, the terrain grows harsher and more complex. Hills, moors, forests, and shifting weather complicate control. The farther Rome extends, the more effort it requires to maintain its presence, and the less complete that presence becomes. In these regions, the Celtic world remains layered rather than replaced. Roman forts dot strategic points, their walls precise and unyielding, yet beyond them lie communities that continue to live largely as they always have. Roundhouses persist. Seasonal movement of people and animals remains common. Kinship networks retain their importance. Roman authority is acknowledged, sometimes resented, sometimes ignored, but rarely internalized in the same way as in the south. The north of Britain, beyond the reach of lasting Roman settlement, becomes a boundary not only of empire, but of worldview. Hadrian's Wall, and later the Antonine Wall farther north, are not merely defensive structures. They are statements of limitation. Rome can draw a line, but it cannot fully cross it. Beyond these walls, Celtic societies continue to define themselves through local custom and memory rather than imperial rule. Ireland stands apart even more distinctly. Never formally conquered by Rome, it remains outside the empire's administrative reach. Roman goods arrive through trade and contact, but Roman law does not. This distance allows older social structures to persist with less disruption. Druids and learned figures retain influence longer here, adapting gradually rather than disappearing abruptly. Oral tradition remains central, carrying law, genealogy, and belief across generations. Life in these island worlds is shaped by isolation and connection in equal measure. The sea acts as both barrier and pathway. Boats move along coasts and between islands, carrying people, stories, and goods. Coastal communities are outward-looking, familiar with distant shores and foreign accents, yet deeply rooted in local landscapes. The sound of waves, the scent of salt, and the constant presence of weather shape daily existence. Belief continues to center on place. Springs, stones, hills, and ancient trees retain their significance. Without the pressure to formalize worship within Roman-style temples, sacred spaces remain embedded in the land itself. Rituals are smaller, quieter, and more flexible. They adapt to new influences without losing their core orientation toward balance and relationship rather than command. Language, too, holds its ground more firmly here. Celtic tongues remain the primary means of communication, unchallenged by Latin in daily life. This linguistic continuity preserves not only words, but ways of thinking. Concepts embedded in grammar, metaphor, and idiom carry forward older understandings of time, kinship, and responsibility. Language becomes a vessel of resistance without ever needing to declare itself as such. Social organization remains decentralized. Authority flows through lineage and reputation rather than imposed office. Leaders are expected to negotiate, to persuade, to embody communal values rather than enforce abstract law. This expectation limits the scale of political ambition but strengthens social cohesion. Conflict occurs, but it is managed within familiar frameworks, often mediated by figures whose authority rests on memory and fairness rather than coercion. These regions are not frozen in time. Change arrives gradually through contact, migration, and internal development. New technologies appear, new artistic styles emerge. Christianity will eventually arrive, not as an imperial mandate, but as a quiet presence carried by travelers and teachers. Yet change unfolds here at a pace that allows integration rather than rupture. Emotionally, life beyond the empire carries a different weight. There is less certainty, fewer guarantees of protection or infrastructure, but also less intrusion. People rely more heavily on one another and on their environment. The land is not measured and recorded in the same way. It is known through use, story, and familiarity. Identity remains deeply local, grounded in place rather than abstraction. As centuries pass, these island regions become repositories of memory. Practices that fade elsewhere persist here, sometimes transformed, sometimes remarkably intact. Stories retain older structures. Art preserves curved motifs and symbolic ambiguity. Even when new beliefs take root, they do so by layering over existing frameworks rather than erasing them. At night, far from the glow of Roman towns, fires burn low in scattered settlements. The sound of wind moves across hills and water. Voices carry stories that stretch back beyond any written record. In these moments, the Celtic world feels less like a remnant and more like a continuation, altered, yes, but unbroken. These islands beyond the empire do not merely survive Rome, they outlast it. When imperial authority eventually weakens and withdraws, it is here that older rhythms will help shape what comes next. Memory, preserved through distance and attention, waits patiently for a future that will need it more than it yet knows. Part 12. The soft arrival of the cross. Change does not always arrive with the sound of marching feet or the weight of stone. Sometimes it comes quietly, carried by voices rather than armies, by gestures rather than decrees. In the Celtic worlds that lie beyond the firm grasp of Roman authority, and even within its fading borders, one of the most profound transformations unfolds in this quieter way. Christianity arrives not as a thunderclap, but as a murmur, gradually weaving itself into landscapes already dense with meaning. Unlike Rome's earlier advances, the spread of the cross does not begin with conquest in these regions. It moves instead along familiar routes of travel and trust. Traders carry stories, wanderers bring ideas. Small groups gather around teachers whose authority rests not on power, but on persuasion and example. The new faith enters a world already accustomed to thinking in layers, already comfortable with the idea that unseen forces shape visible life. For many Celtic communities, Christianity does not feel immediately foreign. Its emphasis on sacred time, moral order, and the presence of the divine within the world resonates with existing belief structures. The concept of saints blends naturally with earlier reverence for local spiritual figures. Holy wells are not abandoned, they are renamed. Sacred hills do not lose their power, they acquire new stories. The old landscape absorbs new meaning rather than being stripped of it. Monastic life becomes the primary vessel for this transformation. Unlike urban-centered Christianity elsewhere in the former Roman world, Celtic Christianity develops in rural, often remote settings. Monasteries rise on islands, along rugged coasts, and in isolated valleys. These are not grand institutions of stone and hierarchy at first, but modest communities built around discipline, labor, and study. Their isolation is intentional. Distance from power is seen as closeness to the divine. Within these monastic spaces, older traditions find unexpected refuge. Literacy becomes a sacred skill, and with it comes the impulse to record. But what is written is not limited to scripture alone. Genealogies, laws, poems, and stories that once lived only in memory begin to find their way onto vellum. The act of writing does not erase the oral past. It preserves fragments of it, shaped by the worldview of those who remember. This process is not neutral. Monks interpret what they record through Christian frameworks, sometimes reshaping narratives to fit new moral structures. Pagan gods become legendary heroes or cautionary figures. Otherworldly encounters are reframed as tests of faith or encounters with saints. Yet beneath these adaptations, older patterns persist. The rhythm of the stories, the importance of kinship, the intimacy with landscape, these elements survive translation. The daily life of these religious communities reflects continuity as much as change. Work follows the seasons, prayer punctuates the day, but so does farming, fishing, and craft. The sound of chanting mingles with the sound of wind and water. Manuscripts are copied slowly, carefully, often illuminated with designs that echo older Celtic aesthetics, spirals, interlacing forms, and intricate patterns that refuse rigid symmetry. Outside monastic walls, conversion is gradual and uneven. Some communities adopt Christianity enthusiastically, seeing in it a source of cohesion and new authority. Others incorporate it selectively, blending Christian rites with older customs. There is rarely a moment when the old faith is formally renounced. Instead, it fades, overlaps, and transforms, leaving traces embedded in practice rather than doctrine. Socially, the new faith alters power structures subtly. Where Druidic authority once mediated law and memory, clerical figures increasingly assume these roles. Yet unlike Roman administrators, these figures are often local, drawn from the same kin networks they serve. Their authority feels personal rather than imposed. They advise, teach, and arbitrate, extending influence through example rather than enforcement. The emotional tone of this transformation is complex. Christianity introduces new ideas of guilt, redemption, and linear history, a beginning, a fall, an end. These concepts coexist uneasily with older cyclical understandings of time. For some, the promise of salvation offers comfort in uncertain times. For others, it introduces anxiety where once there was balance. Communities navigate these tensions pragmatically, emphasizing what aligns with lived experience. Art reflects this synthesis. Crosses are carved with interlacing designs that blur boundaries between Christian symbol and older visual language. Stone monuments stand where sacred sites once were, their surfaces alive with movement. Manuscripts glow with color and detail, their margins filled with creatures and patterns that seem to breathe. The sacred is no longer confined to nature alone, it inhabits text and image as well. Importantly, this transformation unfolds without the total collapse of local identity. Celtic languages continue to be spoken, prayed in, and written. Saints acquire local characteristics tied to specific places and histories. Christianity becomes Celtic without ceasing to be Christian, shaped by the same adaptability that has long defined the culture. As generations pass, the old gods recede, not violently, but gently, like voices fading at dusk. Their presence lingers in story and custom, in place names and seasonal rhythms. The new faith does not erase memory, it rearranges it, creating a layered spiritual landscape where past and present coexist. At night, in monasteries lit by small lamps, monks bend over pages, their breath visible in cold air. Outside, the land rests as it always has, shaped by wind, water, and time. The cross has arrived, softly and persistently, settling into a world that knows how to change without forgetting. And in that quiet accommodation, the Celtic world finds another way to endure, not by resisting transformation, but by absorbing it, preserving its essence beneath new forms that will carry memory forward into centuries yet to come. Part 13. Ink, Vellum, and Memory. When the spoken world begins to lean toward the written, something delicate is at stake. Writing can preserve, but it can also narrow. It fixes what was once fluid, chooses one version where many once coexisted, and gives endurance to some voices while allowing others to fade. In the Celtic regions shaped by monastic life, this tension becomes central. The page opens, and with it, a quiet negotiation between memory and ink begins. Monasteries, scattered across coasts, islands, and inland valleys, become workshops of attention. Their buildings are simple at first: timber, stone gathered locally, roofs designed to endure wind and rain rather than impress the eye. Inside, however, time stretches differently. Days are divided by prayer, work, and study. Silence is practiced deliberately, not as absence, but as space in which memory can surface. Vellum, made from animal skin, carries a texture that is impossible to ignore. It resists the pen slightly, reminding the writer that nothing is effortless. Ink must be prepared carefully. Quills are shaped and reshaped. Writing is slow, physical, and intimate. Each page represents hours of labor, each mistake costly. This slowness shapes what is written. Only what feels worth preserving makes its way onto the page. At first, scripture dominates. Psalms, gospels, commentaries, texts that anchor the new faith. But alongside these, other materials begin to appear. Genealogies are recorded, tracing lineages back through remembered ancestors. Law tracts outline customary practices, translated into written form without fully losing their relational nature. Poems and tales, once recited by firelight, are adapted carefully, framed as history, legend, or moral example. The act of recording is selective, shaped by the worldview of the scribes. Pagan gods are rarely named directly as objects of worship. Instead, they re-emerge as heroic figures, kings, or supernatural beings whose power is impressive but limited. Otherworldly realms are described as wondrous but morally ambiguous. Encounters with ancient forces are reinterpreted through Christian ethics, emphasizing humility, temptation, and redemption. Yet beneath this reinterpretation, older structures persist. Stories remain episodic rather than linear, moving through cycles of challenge and return. Landscapes remain active participants, shaping events and testing characters. Kinship continues to matter deeply, driving conflict and obligation. Even when the language shifts, the underlying rhythm feels familiar. Illumination becomes a bridge between worlds. Manuscripts are adorned with intricate designs that echo earlier Celtic art, spirals, knots, and interlacing forms that refuse straight lines and clear beginnings or endings. These images do more than decorate. They suggest continuity, embedding older visual sensibilities within sacred text. The margins come alive with creatures and patterns, as if memory itself has found a way to breathe around the words. Language plays a crucial role in this preservation. In many regions, Latin serves as the formal medium of learning and prayer, but local Celtic languages remain present. Glosses appear in margins, explaining difficult passages in the vernacular. Poems and genealogies are recorded in native tongues. This bilingualism ensures that memory does not become entirely foreign to those it describes. The written word, though introduced from outside, is domesticated. The preservation of law offers another example of adaptation. Celtic legal traditions, once entirely oral, are written down in ways that maintain their emphasis on compensation, restoration, and social balance. Punishment remains contextual. Responsibility remains shared. Even as these laws are framed within Christian morality, they retain their distinctive character, reflecting a society that values relationship over abstraction. This process is uneven and fragile. Many stories are lost before they can be recorded. Others survive only in fragments, reshaped by centuries of copying and interpretation. What remains is not a complete picture of the pre-Christian Celtic world, but a series of echoes, partial, refracted, and precious, precisely because of their incompleteness. The scribes themselves are aware of this fragility. Marginal notes sometimes express anxiety about forgetting, about errors introduced through copying, about the weight of responsibility carried by each pen stroke. Writing becomes an act of care, a form of stewardship rather than control. The past is not owned, it is tended. Outside monastic walls, life continues much as it always has. Fields are worked, livestock tended, stories are still told aloud, changing subtly with each telling. The written versions do not replace these living traditions. They coexist with them, sometimes influencing, sometimes being ignored. Memory remains active, not archived. Emotionally, this period carries a sense of quiet urgency. There is an awareness that something is slipping away, even as something else is being secured. The old gods are no longer named openly, yet their presence lingers in metaphor and place. The new faith offers structure and hope, but it also narrows the range of acceptable meaning. The page both saves and confines. As centuries pass, manuscripts travel. They are copied, carried across water and land, surviving fires, raids, and neglect. Each copy introduces variation, small shifts that reflect the hand and mind of the scribe. Memory does not freeze, it migrates. What survives does so through motion. At night, in a cell lit by a single lamp, a monk pauses, listening to the wind press against stone. The page before him holds words older than he is, older than his teachers, older even than the faith he serves. He copies carefully, knowing that he is not merely preserving text, but carrying forward a way of seeing the world, one shaped by curve and cycle, by land and lineage, by endurance rather than dominion. In this quiet labor, the Celtic past does not vanish. It changes form. It becomes ink and vellum, bound into volumes that will outlast kingdoms. Memory, once carried entirely in breath, now learns to rest on the page, not to sleep, but to wait, ready to be read, spoken, and reimagined by those who come after. Part 14. Language as a last shelter. When monuments crumble and institutions fade, language often remains. It carries memory in its smallest details, in the way time is described, in how relationships are named, in the metaphors used to make sense of loss and return. For the Celtic world, language becomes one of the final and most resilient shelters, a place where identity can persist quietly even as political and religious structures transform around it. As Roman authority weakens and reorganizes, and as Christianity reshapes spiritual life, Celtic languages do not disappear. They retreat, concentrate, and adapt. Latin dominates administration, scripture, and formal learning, but it rarely replaces the language spoken at home, in fields, or during informal ritual. In these everyday spaces, older tongues continue to breathe, carrying with them ways of understanding the world that cannot be fully translated. Language preserves relationships to land. Place names encode memory, marking where events occurred, where boundaries were respected, where something meaningful once happened. Hills, rivers, valleys, and settlements retain names that predate conquest, their sounds shaped by centuries of use. Even when written records adopt Latin forms, the spoken names persist locally, anchoring communities to their environment in ways that maps cannot capture. Grammar itself carries worldview. In Celtic languages, time is often expressed relationally rather than absolutely, tied to cycles and context. The future is approached cautiously, the past felt as present influence rather than distant fact. Possession is framed through relationship rather than ownership. These subtle structures reinforce older sensibilities, reminding speakers daily that life is not static, that identity is shared, and that continuity matters. Storytelling thrives within this linguistic shelter. Tales of heroes, saints, and ancestors circulate in vernacular speech, evolving as they pass from one generation to the next. These stories are not preserved unchanged. They are alive. They absorb new influences, respond to current concerns, and yet retain recognizable cores. The act of telling becomes a form of belonging, a way to situate oneself within a lineage that extends backward and forward in time. Music and poetry deepen this preservation. Song embeds language in rhythm and melody, making it easier to remember and harder to erase. Lullabies, laments, and work songs carry vocabulary and imagery across generations, often learned before formal instruction begins. Even when external pressures encourage linguistic conformity, music provides a quiet resistance, reinforcing identity without confrontation. Education remains informal in many regions. Children learn language through immersion rather than instruction, absorbing not only words, but social expectations and values. Elders correct gently, emphasizing clarity and appropriateness rather than rigid standardization. This flexibility allows dialects to flourish, reflecting local experience while maintaining mutual intelligibility across wider regions. Religion, too, adapts linguistically. Prayers are spoken in local tongues alongside Latin liturgy. Sermons are translated or paraphrased to ensure understanding. Saints' lives are retold in vernacular form, blending Christian themes with familiar narrative patterns. Faith becomes intelligible through the language of everyday life, allowing belief to integrate rather than dominate. Political fragmentation in the post-Roman period further strengthens the role of language as identity marker. As centralized authority diminishes, local rulers and communities rely more heavily on shared speech to define belonging. Language distinguishes insider from outsider, neighbor from stranger. It becomes a social boundary that requires no enforcement, only participation. Yet this shelter is not impermeable. Pressures mount over time. New ruling elites introduce their own languages and customs. Trade encourages bilingualism. Prestige shifts toward languages associated with power and opportunity. Celtic languages respond by borrowing, adapting, and reshaping themselves rather than resisting outright. Loan words enter vocabulary, integrated seamlessly into existing structures. This adaptability ensures survival, but it also alters form. Pronunciation shifts. Grammar simplifies or reorganizes. Dialects diverge. What emerges is not a single Celtic language, but a family of related tongues, Irish, Welsh, Breton, and others, each shaped by its own history and environment. Unity persists through resemblance rather than uniformity. Emotionally, language becomes a site of intimacy. It is the language spoken in moments of grief and affection, the language used to comfort children and remember the dead. These contexts resist replacement. Even when official life operates in another tongue, the language of feeling remains local, preserving identity at its most vulnerable points. Written literature begins to appear in these languages, often centuries after their oral traditions have flourished. When this happens, it marks both preservation and transformation. Writing fixes certain forms, elevates particular dialects, and introduces standards that did not previously exist. Yet it also ensures visibility, granting these languages a presence beyond the immediate community. As the medieval period unfolds, Celtic languages persist in pockets, sometimes flourishing, sometimes pressured. They are spoken in courts and monasteries, in villages, and along coasts. They survive raids, migrations, and political upheaval, carried by people rather than protected by institutions. At dusk, in a small settlement far from any center of power, voices gather. Stories are told in a language that feels natural, unmarked, assumed. Children listen without thinking about preservation or identity. They learn simply by being present. In this unself-conscious transmission, the shelter holds. Language does not shout its endurance, it whispers it, daily, persistently. And through these whispers, the Celtic world continues to exist, not as a political entity, not as a unified culture, but as a living inheritance carried in sound, meaning, and shared understanding. As time moves forward, the fires that once marked ritual gatherings fade, and new forms of community emerge. Yet the words remain, ready to shape memory into whatever future awaits them. Part 15. What remains after the fires fade? When a culture no longer rules, no longer conquers, no longer names the age it lives in, it does not vanish. it changes its way of existing. It becomes quieter, less visible, more easily overlooked, and in doing so, sometimes more enduring than the powers that replaced it. This is the final shape of the Celtic world, not an ending, but a long settling into memory, influence, and quiet persistence. By the later medieval period, the Celts no longer appear in history as a unified people, if they ever truly did. They are described instead through fragments, Irish kingdoms rising and falling, Welsh principalities resisting pressure, Breton communities maintaining language and custom across water and time. Political independence fluctuates, borders shift, yet beneath these changes something recognizably Celtic continues to breathe. The landscape still carries the imprint. Ancient hill forts soften under grass and moss, their outlines visible only to those who know how to look. Sacred springs remain in use, sometimes officially Christian, sometimes quietly visited for reasons no longer explained aloud. Paths follow routes older than any surviving map, shaped by feet that walked them long before record. The land remembers even when institutions forget. Music becomes one of the most durable vessels of continuity. Melodies passed down without written notation preserve patterns of emotion older than formal history. Laments carry grief shaped by centuries of loss and endurance. Dance tunes hold communal rhythm, binding bodies together in motion that requires no explanation. Even when words change, melody remembers how to feel. Story, too, persists, not as fixed canon, but as living inheritance. Arthurian legends, shaped and reshaped over generations, carry echoes of earlier heroic traditions. Otherworldly journeys, enchanted landscapes, and ambiguous moral worlds continue to surface in tales told for entertainment, instruction, or comfort. These stories do not announce themselves as ancient. They simply feel familiar, resonant, as if they have always been there. Christianity, now fully embedded, does not erase this inheritance. Saints take on local character. Miracles happen in specific places, tied to wells, stones, and hills already heavy with meaning. Festivals align with older seasonal rhythms. The sacred calendar overlays the agricultural one rather than replacing it. Faith becomes another layer rather than a clean break. Externally, pressure continues. Political centralization, linguistic dominance, and economic change threaten local autonomy. Celtic languages retreat further, sometimes marginalized, sometimes actively suppressed. Yet even under these conditions, they endure in private spaces, kitchens, fields, gatherings, carried by those who refuse to surrender the language of intimacy. Modernity eventually arrives with its own force. Industrialization reshapes landscapes. Urbanization pulls people away from rural continuity. Education systems standardize language and history, often privileging dominant narratives. The Celtic past risks becoming romanticized or flattened into symbol, tartans, myths, motifs detached from lived reality. Yet something resists simplification. Revival movements emerge, not from nostalgia alone, but from recognition. Scholars, poets, musicians, and ordinary speakers begin to reclaim language, story, and memory as living resources rather than relics. What was once dismissed as backward is re-examined as resilient. What survived quietly is allowed to speak again. In this modern context, the Celtic world no longer seeks to dominate space. It inhabits time instead. It exists in continuity rather than conquest. Its influence is felt in how people imagine relationship to land, to ancestry, to story. It shapes environmental sensitivity, narrative ambiguity, and emotional restraint, qualities often unnoticed but deeply formative. Emotionally, the legacy of the Celts is not triumphal. It does not declare victory. It carries instead a tone of acceptance, of endurance shaped by loss and adaptation. This tone resonates across centuries, offering a model of survival that does not depend on control. To persist without ruling is not weakness here. It is wisdom learned through long experience. The fires that once marked ritual gatherings no longer burn in the same way. Hilltop assemblies fade. Druidic voices fall silent. Empires rise and collapse. Yet something remains, in curved lines, in layered belief, in languages that refuse to die entirely, in stories that feel older than their telling. At the quietest level, this endurance lives in ordinary acts, a song sung without knowing its age, a place name spoken correctly despite pressure to forget, a story told not because it is ancient, but because it still makes sense. These acts require no declaration, they are enough. And so the history of the Celts does not conclude with disappearance, it concludes with diffusion into landscape, language, and habit. If you enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, maybe leave a like, or just let the story carry you to sleep. If you'd like more quiet journeys like this one, you can subscribe, but only if it feels right. The world remembers you.